Around 6:30 inches the evening on the 10th of December 1991, a 22-year-old security guard named Brian Ruff was sitting inside a small guard shack at the Kenotok copper mine in northern Utah. He had a college textbook open in front of him, trying to study. The shack he was in was tiny, barely big enough for one person, with windows on all four sides. And when Brian looked out of those windows, all he saw was darkness. The sun had set a while ago, and this part of the mine was completely isolated. There were no streetlights, no other buildings nearby. The only light came from the moon reflecting off the fresh snow on the ground, which made everything outside look kind of eerie and desolate. Brian had been a security guard at this mine for just over a year, but he'd only been assigned to this specific guard shack for a couple of weeks. And in his opinion, it was the absolute worst post he could have possibly gotten. His job was to stand guard at a chain-link gate that blocked off a remote service road leading deep into the canyons. Because it was such an out-of-the-way entrance to the mine, almost no vehicles ever came through. So most of the time, the job was just incredibly boring. He would just sit there for hours watching the snowfall. But at the same time, it was also a very dangerous post. The Kennecott copper mine was famous. People called it the richest hole on Earth because of the massive amounts of copper, gold, and silver buried in the ground there. And all that valuable material made the mine a huge target for thieves. In just the last few months alone, over $150,000 worth of equipment and precious metals had been stolen. So Brian was always a little on edge out here, all by himself in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't just the pitch blackness that got to him. It was also the fact that he was totally unarmed. The company didn't provide guards with any weapons. He didn't even have security cameras. If he ran into a group of thieves, his only defense was a telephone on his desk to call for help. But on this particular night, his shift had been completely normal. It was slow, quiet, and uneventful. So Brian decided to use the downtime to get some studying in. He was in nursing school, and his final exams were just a few days away. He was poring over his notes and textbooks, trying to cram as much information as he could into his head. While he was studying, he took out a thermos. His wife had packed him some soup for dinner. He unscrewed the lid, and just as he was about to take his first spoonful, the phone on his desk started ringing. Brian immediately hesitated. He knew there was a very good chance it was his wife Jennifer on the other end. But things at home right now were not great. Jennifer worked as a nurse's aide, and Brian had taken on this night shift at the mine to help pay the bills while he was in nursing school during the day. But even with both of them working, money was incredibly tight. And to make things even more stressful, Jennifer was pregnant with their second child. The pressure of balancing school, work, and raising a family had been putting a huge strain on their marriage. About a month ago, Brian had hit a breaking point. He'd actually walked out on his family. He left a simple note for Jennifer, saying he just needed some time alone to think things over. Then he drove to the mine, turned in his security badge, and told his boss he was quitting. After that, he just left town. He spent almost a week in Las Vegas, and then he drove all the way out to San Francisco. He was trying to clear his head, but while he was out there, he got a call. His daughter, back home in Utah, was in the emergency room with a bad case of pneumonia. For Brian, that was the wake-up call he needed. He realized he couldn't live with himself if he actually abandoned his family for good. So he immediately got in his car and drove straight back to Utah to be with Jennifer and his daughter. His daughter, thankfully, made a full recovery. And Jennifer, despite him just up and leaving them, she agreed to take him back. But just because he was home didn't mean things went back to normal. There was this constant tension hanging over their relationship. Jennifer hadn't fully forgiven him for what he'd done, and Brian felt like he was walking on eggshells all the time. So now, sitting in the guard shack, Brian took a deep breath before picking up the ringing phone. It was Jennifer. He chatted with her for a few minutes, trying to keep the conversation light. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something through the window. It was a flash of headlights, coming up the service road directly towards his guard shack. He told Jennifer he had to go, hung up the phone, and stepped outside to meet the vehicle that was pulling up. About an hour and a half later, around 8 p.m., Brian's boss, a supervisor named Todd Fallows, pulled up to the gate next to the guard shack. He noticed the lights were on inside the shack, but he couldn't see anyone moving around in there. Todd thought this was pretty strange. Brian was under strict orders not to leave his post for any reason. That was the most important rule of the job. You stay put, no matter what. What made it even weirder was that Brian's car was parked right next to the shack. This post was so far away from anything else on the mine property, there was literally nowhere for Brian to go without his car, especially not in the freezing cold. So where was he? Todd was starting to feel a little uneasy. He parked his own vehicle, got out, and walked over to the shack. He opened the door and stepped inside. The tiny space was empty. Brian was gone. But on the desk, Todd saw Brian's hat and his half-eaten thermos of soup. It looked like he had just gotten up and walked away in the middle of his dinner. At this point, Todd knew something was wrong. He picked up the phone inside the shack and called the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Department to report a missing person. Less than an hour later, Detective Manny Lassig was driving down a dark, snowy desert road heading towards the Kennetock copper mine. Everyone in law enforcement knew this mine was a hotbed for theft. So, when the sheriff's department got a call that a security guard had vanished in the middle of his shift, Detective Lassig didn't waste any time. The first thought was that this could be related to thieves. Maybe they had kidnapped Brian, or worse. When Lassig pulled up to the main entrance of the mine, he saw another vehicle parked there. It flashed its headlights at him. A man in a security guard uniform rolled down his window and waved Lassig over. Lassig pulled up alongside him, and the man introduced himself as Todd Fallows, the supervisor who had made the call about the missing guard. Todd started his engine and told Lassig to follow him. And so Lassig did. He followed Todd's taillights deeper into the darkness, down a winding road that led into the canyons. The Kennetock mine was huge, covering 3 square miles of rocky, mountainous terrain. They drove for a solid 10 minutes before Lassig finally saw a single light up ahead. It was the guard shack where Brian had been stationed. The two men parked their cars and got out. Todd pointed to the shack and told Detective Lassig that this was where Brian was supposed to be. Lassig pulled out a flashlight and aimed it at the ground around the shack, but there wasn't much to see. It had been snowing all evening, so any potential footprints or tire tracks were already covered up. So, Lassig stepped inside the shack. At first glance, everything looked normal. There was no blood, nothing was knocked over, no signs of any kind of struggle. But there on the desk was Brian's hat and that half-eaten thermos of soup. It was a strange little detail that just didn't feel right. Lassig was trying to process the scene, running through different theories in his head, looking for any clue about what might have happened. As he was thinking, the phone on the desk rang again. Detective Lassig just picked it up. He answered, and a woman on the other end sounded surprised. She said her name was Jennifer Ruff, and she was trying to call her husband Brian. Lassig quickly explained that he was with the sheriff's department and that her husband had left his post sometime during the night and couldn't be found. He was literally in the middle of investigating his disappearance. He then asked Jennifer when she had last spoken to Brian. Jennifer, obviously shocked by the news, told him she had just talked to him a couple of hours ago. She said they were on the phone and then Brian suddenly had to hang up because he saw a car approaching the shack. Lassig asked her if Brian had said anything specific about the car or who might be driving it. But Jennifer said no. He just said a car was coming and he had to go. Lassig was a bit disappointed there wasn't more information, but he thanked Jennifer and promised to be in touch as soon as he knew anything. He hung up the phone and turned his attention back to the tiny room. But just a few seconds later, the phone rang again. Lassig picked it up. And again, a woman on the line said she was Brian's wife, Jennifer, and she was asking where he was. But as Lassig was listening, he realized something was very wrong. This woman's voice sounded nothing like the woman he had just spoken to a minute ago, who had also claimed to be Jennifer. And this second woman clearly had no idea about their previous conversation. He was talking to two different people, both of them claiming to be Brian Ruff's wife. Obviously, only one of them could be telling the truth, which meant one of these women had to be lying. A few days later, in mid-December of 1991, Detective Manny Lassig was sitting at the dining room table in the Ruffs' home. He had a cup of coffee in his hand and was sitting across from Brian's wife, Jennifer. Brian was still missing, and the investigation had been moving at a snail's pace. For the first few days, everyone was kind of hoping that Brian would just show up on his own, that maybe he had run off again like he had before. But as the days turned into a week, that seemed less and less likely. By now, Detective Lassig had traced the phone numbers of both women who had called the guard shack that night. He quickly confirmed that one of the calls had come from Jennifer Ruff's work phone number. So, he was pretty sure he was now sitting with the real Jennifer Ruff. But he was still trying to figure out why another woman would call and impersonate her. And the timing of the calls was just too strange to be a coincidence. One right after the other. It was bizarre. So, as Lassig sat across from Jennifer, he started by asking her for her alibi. Where had she been on the night Brian disappeared? She told him she had been at the hospital all night, working a long shift. She even gave Lassig the names of several of her coworkers who could back up her story. Then, Lassig changed the subject completely. He looked her in the eye and asked her, point blank, if there was any chance her husband could have been having an affair. Were there other women in his life? Had he been acting strange or secretive lately? The reason he asked, of course, was because of that second mysterious phone call. He knew there was another woman out there, even if Jennifer didn't. When Jennifer heard the question, she looked down at the table for a moment. Then she looked back up at him and said, yes, she was suspicious of that. She told Lassig all about the problems they'd been having in their marriage. She told him how, just the month before, Brian had suddenly run off, saying he needed time alone. He was gone for a week with no contact, until he just showed up again, begging her to take him back. When Lassig heard that, he leaned back in his chair. He started to wonder if this whole investigation was a waste of time. If Brian had a history of just taking off without warning, what was to stop him from doing it again? Maybe this wasn't a crime at all. Maybe Brian would just turn up in a few days, just like last time. But Jennifer must have sensed what he was thinking, because she quickly added that the first time he left, he had at least left a note. And he'd told his boss he was quitting. There was some kind of warning. She insisted that it was not like Brian to just vanish in the middle of his shift like this, leaving his dinner half-eaten. He had his faults, she said, but this was different. Detective Lassig asked Jennifer if she knew where Brian had gone during that week he was away. In response, Jennifer got up and handed him a piece of mail from a nearby table. It was a credit card bill that had arrived that week, addressed to Brian. She explained she was confused when she saw it because, as far as she knew, Brian didn't even have a credit card. But apparently he did, and he had used it a lot while he was gone to pay for hotels, meals, and other things. Lassig took the bill and started looking it over. He saw a lot of charges from Las Vegas and San Francisco, and the amounts for restaurant meals and room service seemed a little high for just one person. He looked up from the bill at Jennifer, and he could tell from the look on her face that they had both come to the same conclusion. When Brian was away that week, he probably hadn't been alone. Jennifer then handed Lassig another piece of paper. It was their phone bill, with a detailed list of every call made and received over the past month. Jennifer said there were a bunch of numbers on the list that she didn't recognize. She thought maybe one of them belonged to the person Brian had been traveling with. As Lassig looked over the list of numbers, one of them immediately jumped out at him. It was the same number that the second woman, the fake Jennifer, had called from on the night Brian disappeared. Later that same day, Lassig was sitting in the living room of the house associated with that phone number. Across from him was a young woman named Christy Bradley. Her husband, Dale Bradley, was also a security guard at the Kenotok mine, the same place Brian worked. Dale wasn't home at the moment, and Lassig wanted to talk to Christy alone before he got back. So, he didn't beat around the bush. He told Christy that he was almost certain she and Brian had been having an affair. Before she could even respond, he pulled out the credit card bill Jennifer had given him and showed her the evidence. For a second, Christy looked like she was going to deny it. But then her face crumbled and she broke down and admitted everything. She said she and Brian had been seeing each other for a while. She confirmed that they had run away together the month before for about a week. And even though they had both come back to their families, she said they were still very much in touch. She said that's why she had called the guard shack on the night Brian disappeared. She was just calling to talk to him. But when a strange man's voice answered the phone, Detective Lassig, she said she panicked. On instinct, she just lied and pretended to be Jennifer, his wife, so that their affair wouldn't be discovered. But she was very clear about one thing. She hadn't heard from Brian since that night, and she had no idea what happened to him. Lassig sat back and just watched her for a moment. She seemed genuinely worried about Brian. And even though her call to the guard shack was incredibly suspicious, her explanation for it actually made a twisted kind of sense. Still, he wasn't about to rule her out as a suspect just yet. And now her husband Dale was also a primary suspect. If he had found out about his wife's affair with his friend and coworker, he would have a powerful motive for revenge. The next day, Lassig walked into an interrogation room at the sheriff's station. Dale Bradley was already sitting there, waiting for him. The moment Lassig came in, Dale asked if there was any news about Brian. Lassig said no, not yet. And to Lassig, Dale's concern seemed real. He sat down and asked Dale how long he'd known Brian. Dale said they'd met about a year ago when Brian started working at the mine, and they had become pretty good friends. They even hung out together outside of work sometimes. Then, trying to catch him off guard, Lassig abruptly changed the subject and asked Dale directly about his wife's affair with Brian. Dale looked completely stunned. He said he didn't know anything about Christy having an affair. Lassig explained what his wife had already confessed to. Dale seemed genuinely devastated. The idea that his wife was cheating on him, especially with a man he considered a close friend, was clearly a huge shock. As Dale was trying to process this, Lassig asked him where he was on the night of December 10th when Brian disappeared. Dale, still reeling from the news, took a moment to compose himself. He said that on that night his car had actually gotten stuck in the snow. He was at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, which was almost an hour's drive from the mine. He said he even had to call a friend to come and pull his car out of the snowbank, and then he gave Lassig the friend's name so he could verify the story. After writing down the name, Lassig told Dale he wanted him to take a polygraph test. He also said they would need to search his car. Dale agreed to both requests without any hesitation at all. A few weeks later, Lassig was walking across the parking lot at the Kennetock mine. Brian still hadn't been found, and the investigation felt like it was hitting one dead end after another. Dale Bradley and his wife Christy had both taken polygraph tests, and they had both passed. Lassig had also searched Dale's red Mustang, but he found no evidence inside that connected him to Brian's disappearance. On top of that, the friend Dale mentioned had confirmed his story. He said yes, he had gone to help Dale get his Mustang out of the snow that night. So, Dale's alibi seemed solid. At that point, both Dale and Christy were unofficially moved off the suspect list. Lassig had also considered the possibility that Jennifer, Brian's actual wife, might have been involved. Her coworkers confirmed she was at work all evening on the night Brian disappeared, but it wasn't impossible that she had hired someone to harm Brian. She certainly had a motive. But with no evidence against her and still no body, all Lassig had was a gut feeling, and that wasn't enough. But then, just a few days ago, Lassig got a new lead that sent the investigation in a completely new direction. That's why he was back at the Kennetock mine to talk to Brian's supervisor, Todd Fallows, again. Lassig went into the office building and found Todd's office. When Todd saw him, he jumped up from his desk and eagerly greeted him, saying he would do anything he could to help find Brian. Lassig thanked him, but told him to sit back down. Then, Lassig sat down, pulled out a tape recorder, and hit the record button. He then told Todd why he was really there. Two of Brian's fellow security guards had just been arrested for stealing precious metals and equipment from the mine and selling it all at local pawn shops. An internal investigation had uncovered a whole ring of employees who were involved in the thefts. Todd started to look nervous. He shifted in his chair and said he had heard about that, but he insisted he had nothing to do with it. He said he'd already been questioned by detectives from the Property Crimes Division. Lassig said he knew that, and that wasn't why he was there. He explained that when he reviewed the records from the theft investigation, he discovered that Brian had been the one who had reported some of his coworkers for stealing. So now, Lassig had a new theory. What if, on the night he disappeared, Brian had stopped a coworker's car, found stolen materials inside, and they had killed him to silence him? Todd leaned back in his chair, looking thoughtful for a moment. Then he admitted that, yeah, that was possible. He then started telling Detective Lassig about several places on the mine's property where a body could be hidden. As an example, he suggested the giant gravel pile by the concentrator, a machine that crushes minerals and grinds them into dust. Todd explained that if Brian's body had been placed there, it would have been sucked into the grinders and pulverized along with the rocks. He would be completely gone. Detective Lassig was taken aback by how specific Todd was being. It was like he had already thought about this in great detail. Sensing something was off, Lassig just let Todd keep talking. And Todd did. He kept offering up one gruesome theory after another about what could have happened to Brian. At one point, he suggested Brian could have been hidden under the waste piles, where weeks' worth of crushed boulders would have already fallen on top of him, burying him completely. He said if that happened, Brian would be under several tons of rock by now, and the police would never, ever find him. On the 10th of July, 1993, a full year and a half after Brian Ruff disappeared, Detective Lassig was driving through a barren stretch of desert in Utah, about 50 miles south of the Kennetock mine. There had been absolutely no progress on the case for over a year. The sheriff's department had spent countless hours searching the mine with police dogs and helicopters looking for any sign of Brian. But they had found nothing. Not a single trace. By this point, Lassig was sure that foul play was involved. But it was impossible to prove a murder without a body and without any evidence tying his suspects to the crime. For months, his team had investigated every single security guard at the mine, especially the ones involved in the theft ring. But they had verified that every guard who was on duty that night was at their assigned post when Brian vanished. And they had checked the alibis of everyone who wasn't scheduled to work. They couldn't link a single one of them to Brian's disappearance. That included his supervisor, Todd Fallows, who, despite his strangely specific theories, was eventually linked to the theft ring, but had a solid alibi for the night of the murder. As for Christy Bradley, the woman Brian was having an affair with, and her husband Dale, they had been ruled out early on. Their alibis checked out, they passed lie detector tests, and nothing new had come up in the last year and a half to make them suspects again. And Brian's wife, Jennifer, also remained off the list. She had a strong motive, but her alibi of being at work was airtight, and they could find no connection between her and any possible accomplice. So after more than a year of dead ends, the case had gone completely cold. But that morning, the investigation had suddenly come back to life. A group of campers had called the sheriff's department to report finding skeletal remains out in the desert. Lassig knew it was a long shot, but he was hoping it might be Brian. When he arrived at the location the campers had described, he got out of his car and walked across the dry, cracked earth to where a forensics team was setting up crime scene tape in the brush. As Lassig got closer, he could see a human skeleton lying in a shallow, makeshift grave. The skeleton was still wearing clothes, a dust-covered dark blue jacket. Lassig crouched down to get a better look, and he saw that it was a security guard's uniform. He put on a pair of gloves and carefully searched the pockets of the jacket. His fingers closed around a wallet. He pulled it out, opened it, and found an ID card and credit cards, all with the name Brian Ruff. It seemed clear that this was Brian's body. But because it was so decomposed, they would need to check dental records to be 100% sure, and that would take some time. While the crime scene techs carefully removed the remains, Lassig stayed behind with a K9 unit to search the area for any other evidence. And sure enough, just a few feet away from the grave, Lassig found 5 shotgun shells scattered in the dirt. It looked like Brian had been shot 5 times and then buried. Then, a few yards away from the shells, a police dog started barking. An officer called Lassig over. The officer was holding up a black work boot. There was a clear bullet hole right through the leather. Lassig was sure the boot had to be Brian's. But aside from the body and the boot, 18 months of brutal desert weather, scorching heat, wind, sand, snow, and rain had erased almost every other trace of forensic evidence. So even though Lassig now knew where and how Brian had been killed, he was worried he was no closer to figuring out who had done it. 12 years passed. On the 30th of April, 2005, Detective Todd Park of the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office received a phone call. Park had been assigned to the cold case unit at the beginning of the year, and his full-time job was to solve old, forgotten crimes. The detective on the phone was from the sheriff's department in the next county over. He was investigating a recent homicide, and he thought it might be connected to one of Park's cold cases. Specifically, the murder of Brian Ruff. After the call, Park hung up the phone and went straight to his filing cabinet. He dug through the old dusty files until he found the one for Brian Ruff. He sat down at his desk and began sorting through the stacks of decade-old papers. And as he read, he noticed a tiny piece of evidence that the original investigators had somehow overlooked. And upon closer examination, Park realized this small detail was the key to unlocking the entire case. Based on all the forensic evidence, this is what police now believe happened to Brian Ruff on the night of the 10th of December, 1991. Around 6:30 p.m., the killer drove down that dark, winding service road toward the isolated part of the Kennetock mine. Up ahead, they saw the single light from Brian's small guard shack. The killer pulled their car right up to the shack and parked. When they got out, Brian came out of the shack to see who it was. He waved hello. The killer waved back and walked towards Brian. And as soon as they were close enough, they grabbed Brian, spun him around, and tied his hands behind his back. Before Brian could even react, the killer forced him into the back of their vehicle. The killer then got into the driver's seat, made a U-turn, and sped away from the mine, heading out towards the desert. As they drove, Brian was screaming and kicking in the back, trying desperately to escape. But the killer remained calm and just kept driving for nearly an hour until they reached another remote spot deep in the desert, about 50 miles away from the mine. They pulled off the road and stopped in an open, snow-covered patch of land. The killer got out, opened the back door, and dragged Brian out of the car. Brian was still fighting, but he was exhausted. He started pleading for his life, promising that if they just let him go, he would never tell anyone what had happened. But the killer wasn't listening. They grabbed a shovel and a shotgun from their vehicle, untied Brian, and then, at gunpoint, forced him to dig his own grave in the frozen ground. When Brian was finished, the killer raised the shotgun and shot him 5 times. After Brian was dead, they pushed his body into the hole he had just dug. The killer then got back into their car, a red Mustang. But when they tried to drive away, the Mustang's tires spun in the snow. They were stuck. So, they had to make a phone call to a friend for help. The friend came out, having no idea that a murder had just been committed only a few feet away, and helped the killer get their car out of the snow. And then, the killer drove off into the night. The killer was Dale Bradley, the coworker whose wife Brian was having an affair with. Dale's alibi that his car had gotten stuck in the snow an hour away from the mine was true. But it wasn't an alibi. It was a confession. He was describing being stuck at the crime scene. The friend who came to help him was telling the truth when he confirmed the story to the police, but he had no idea he was helping a murderer flee the scene of the crime. The police never cross-referenced the location where Dale said he was stuck with the location where Brian's body was eventually found. And so, they mistakenly believed his story. Additionally, Dale had passed a polygraph test early in the investigation, which made him seem even less like a suspect. He and Christy eventually divorced, likely because of the affair, and Dale later remarried. But in 2005, when his second wife, Crystal, was murdered, the detective investigating her case noticed that Dale Bradley had now been close to two different people who had been murdered. He thought it was too much of a coincidence, so he called Detective Park, the cold case investigator. That phone call prompted Detective Park to take a fresh look at the entire Brian Ruff case file. And that's when he found the note about the tiny speck of red paint found on the sole of the black work boot that was discovered near Brian's body. Park had the paint speck reanalyzed, and he was able to match it perfectly to the paint on the inside of the trunk of Dale Bradley's red Mustang. Dale Bradley was arrested and charged with Brian Ruff's murder on the 19th of September 2005. In 2007, he accepted a plea deal and pleaded guilty to the lesser charges of manslaughter and kidnapping. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. As for his second wife, Crystal, her murder case remains unsolved to this day. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. One night back in May of 1896, a young and promising opera singer was sitting alone inside her dressing room. She was at the Palais Garnier, which is this incredibly grand and beautiful theater right in the heart of Paris, France. Just a little while earlier, the curtain had fallen, and she had finished her performance in a very famous opera. The applause had been thunderous, but now the theater was quiet. She was going through her usual after-show routine, carefully getting changed out of her elaborate costume and taking off her stage makeup. The silence of the massive building was a stark contrast to the energy of the show just an hour before. As she was wiping away the last of her makeup, a sound drifted into her dressing room. It was faint at first, but it was a sound that made the hair on her arms stand up and sent a shiver right down her spine. It sounded like a man singing somewhere deep within the theater. His voice was very low, very deep, and it was filled with a profound sadness. It was an incredibly moving voice, but the thing that was so unsettling about it wasn't the quality of the singing itself. It was the fact that she was hearing a voice at all. As far as she knew, she was supposed to be completely alone in the theater. All the other performers, the musicians, the stagehands, the entire crew, they should have all packed up and gone home for the night by now. The theater was usually locked up tight at this hour. So, who was this person? And where were they? Her heart started to beat a little faster. She stood up from her vanity table and quietly opened her dressing room door, peeking out into the long, dimly lit backstage hallway. She looked left, then right, thinking that maybe one of the other male opera singers had decided to stay behind for some reason. Maybe he was practicing a new piece, though it was an odd time for it. But she didn't see anyone. The hallway was empty. The backstage area was deserted. She stood there, perfectly still, just listening. The man's sad voice was still echoing through the building. As she focused, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, she realized the sound wasn't coming from another dressing room or from the stage. It was coming from below her, from somewhere in the basement levels of the theater. This new realization took her from just feeling a bit unsettled to being genuinely scared. Before she had even started working at the Palais Garnier, she'd heard a story, a rumor that was passed around among the staff. The story went that for the past several years, a man had been secretly living inside the theater, hidden away from the world. The legend said that this same man had been horribly injured in a fire at another nearby theater many years ago. The fire had left him terribly disfigured, and now he was too ashamed and too scared to show his face in public. So, he had supposedly taken up residence in the vast, dark cellars and hidden passageways of the Palais Garnier. The story claimed he only ever came out late at night, when he was certain that he was all alone in the massive building. Up until this moment, this young opera singer had always dismissed the story. She figured it was just a local legend, a ghost story made up to scare new performers, or maybe even to add a bit of mystery and intrigue to the theater to attract more patrons. But now, standing alone in this empty hallway, hearing that strange, mournful voice echoing up from beneath her feet, she couldn't help but wonder if the story might actually be true. And that was an absolutely terrifying thought. She stood there frozen for another minute, listening. She tried to rationalize what she was hearing. Her mind was racing, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe, she thought, it wasn't actually a man's voice at all. Maybe it was just the sound of water moving through the old pipes, or the wind whistling through a vent in a strange way. To be honest, the sound was quite far away and muffled. She started to think, maybe I'm just letting my imagination run wild. Maybe I'm convincing myself this is a person's voice because I heard that silly rumor. She stood there, listening intently, and after a couple of minutes of this internal debate, she had almost convinced herself, no, this isn't a person. These are just the normal late-night creaks and groans that a huge old building like this makes. I'm not usually here this late by myself, so I've just never heard these specific sounds before. It's nothing. And so, telling herself she was convinced, even though a small part of her deep down was still very afraid, she quickly went back into her dressing room. She didn't waste any more time. She gathered up all of her things, threw her coat on, and practically ran out of the theater and into the safety of the Paris night. A few days passed. On the evening of May 20th, that same young opera singer was once again backstage at the Palais Garnier. This time, she wasn't alone. She and the rest of the cast were in the middle of a performance. She was standing in the wings, just off stage, waiting for her cue to make her entrance. She was watching the other actors perform, listening to the music swell from the orchestra pit. But as she was watching the show, she suddenly saw some movement up above the stage, way, way up in the high, dark rafters. She looked up, squinting into the shadows, and she saw a man. He was dressed in dark clothes, which made him very hard to see against the dark ceiling. At first, she thought he must be a stagehand. They were often up there, working the ropes and the counterweights for the scenery. But as she continued to watch him, she realized he wasn't doing anything. He wasn't adjusting ropes or moving equipment. He was just crouched up there, almost hiding in the shadows, and he was staring down intently at the performance below, like he was just a member of the audience who had found a very unusual seat. But then, as she continued to stare up at this mysterious figure, he suddenly turned his head and looked directly down at her. The young singer had to physically hold back a gasp. The man's face was clearly and terribly disfigured. It looked like his skin had been melted and scarred by severe burns. She was terrified. She immediately turned away, rushed over to the nearest crew member, and grabbed his arm. She pointed up into the rafters and said, "There's somebody up there, you have to look." But when the crew member and the singer both looked back up to where the man had been, he was gone. The rafters were empty. Now, the young singer felt absolutely certain that what she had seen just moments before was real. She knew it. But the crew member was giving her a strange look, a look that said, "Are you sure you really saw that?" He seemed very skeptical. It seemed pretty far-fetched to him. Why would anyone be hiding up in the rafters? And certainly not some random person with a scarred face. He was looking at her like she was seeing things. She didn't know what to do, what to say. But the show was still going on. Her cue was coming up. She had to put it out of her mind and perform. About an hour later, the young singer was standing on stage again, this time taking a bow in front of a packed house of nearly 2,000 people. She and the rest of the cast had just finished performing Act 1 of the opera. The audience was going wild. But the young singer had barely made it through the performance. She was still incredibly shaken up by what she had seen up in the rafters. All she wanted to do was get off the stage, go back to her dressing room, and spend the intermission trying to calm her nerves. But now, even though it was only the end of the first act, the crowd was so enthusiastic. They had loved her performance so much that they were calling for her specifically. They wanted her to do an encore of her last big song, her aria. The singer knew she didn't really have a choice. You don't say no to a standing ovation. So she gave a little nod to the conductor in the orchestra pit. Then she reluctantly stepped forward to the front of the stage and restarted the piece. As she began to sing, something amazing happened. Her anxiety actually started to melt away. She let herself get lost in the beautiful music. She closed her eyes, and she belted out a powerful, sustained high note. But suddenly, in the middle of that note, she heard this ear-splitting bang. It was a sound like a gunshot, but much, much louder. She snapped her eyes open just in time to see a brief, bright flash of light from the ceiling high above the audience. Then she watched in absolute horror as the giant, ornate glass chandelier that hung over the center of the auditorium came crashing down. It fell directly on top of a woman in the audience, killing her instantly. The theater erupted into chaos. Police immediately launched an investigation into the falling chandelier. But after a few days, they came to a simple conclusion. They determined that the whole thing was really just a tragic, freak accident. They said that one of the many candles that lit the chandelier had caused a small fire on one of the support ropes. That fire had melted and weakened the cord that held the massive fixture up, causing it to break and fall. But the young singer, she didn't believe this official explanation for a second, because she had seen that burned man hiding in the rafters less than an hour before the disaster. In her mind, she couldn't help but feel that he was somehow to blame. And her theory, as wild and unbelievable as it sounded, actually started to gain some traction. Eventually, the story of the singer and the man in the rafters reached a journalist named Gaston Leroux. He was intrigued by the story and decided to start his own investigation. He spent weeks trying to find this mysterious burned man. He even started showing up unannounced at the theater at all different times of the day and night, hoping to catch him. But he never did. However, Gaston did manage to track down some of the old construction workers who had helped build the Palais Garnier 20 years earlier. And they claimed that they knew exactly who the burned man was. The construction workers told Gaston a story. Before the Palais Garnier was built, there had been another theater right down the block. But that theater had been completely destroyed by a massive fire 20 years earlier, back in 1873. On the night of that fire, a talented young pianist named Ernest had been inside the building. He was working on a wedding march for his fiancée, who was a ballerina at that same theater. Out of nowhere, he began to smell smoke. Before he knew what was happening, the entire building was engulfed in flames, blocking his only way out. He had no choice but to run directly through the fire to escape. By doing so, he suffered terrible, life-altering facial injuries. But he did survive. Unfortunately, his fiancée did not make it out. She died in the fire. The construction workers told Gaston that after this horrible tragedy, Ernest had completely removed himself from society. Not only did his severe burns make it difficult for him to be in public, he was incredibly self-conscious, but he was also completely racked with grief over losing his fiancée. And so they said Ernest had taken refuge in the massive dark basement of the Palais Garnier, which at that point was still under construction. The construction workers said they would often hear Ernest down there playing the piano at all hours of the day and night. He was obsessively trying to finish that wedding march for his lost love. And often, while he was playing, they would hear him screaming and crying out in agony. Now, the workers told Gaston that eventually the sounds from the basement stopped. They stopped hearing Ernest play the piano, and they stopped hearing his cries. They just assumed at that point that he had either left the building or maybe had even died down there. Or, they admitted, it's possible they never really heard him at all. Maybe they had just convinced themselves they were hearing him, caught up in the tragedy of his story. They really didn't know for sure. But then, after the Palais Garnier was finished and opened to the public, performers at the new theater started reporting strange things. They would hear a sad voice singing late at night after everyone was gone. And some even reported seeing a man with a scarred face creeping around in the dark corners and corridors of the theater. But whenever these people would investigate, trying to see where the sound was coming from or who the man was, nobody was ever there. And so, after hearing this whole story from the construction workers, Gaston Leroux, the journalist, was sort of conflicted. On one hand, he was deeply disturbed by these two tragedies, separated by 20 years. You had the fire that claimed the life of Ernest's fiancée and horribly disfigured Ernest himself, and then you had the chandelier falling and killing a guest at the new theater 20 years later. That was all horrible, all tragic. But more than that, the feeling that Gaston had was that he felt sort of deeply moved by the story of Ernest's powerful love for his fiancée. Whether or not the story was even true, whether or not he really did hide in the basement and try to finish that song for his dead fiancée, it didn't really matter. It was that element of tragic romance combined with all the rumors of there being a ghost in the theater that was just incredibly compelling. The idea of poor, tragic Ernest and his lost love, that's what really stuck out to the journalist. And so ultimately, Gaston ended up writing a book about the story. And that book was then adapted into one of the most famous and beloved musicals of all time. Today, Ernest is more often known by the nickname that Gaston Leroux gave him, the Phantom of the Opera. On the 29th of September 1939, a British intelligence agent walked with a determined stride through the front door of the Royal Navy headquarters in London. He had a simple manila envelope tucked securely under his arm. As soon as he stepped inside, a uniformed doorman stopped him and politely asked to see his pass. The agent flashed a small badge that identified him only by his code name, 17F. The doorman gave a quick, knowing nod and let him through without another word. Agent 17F then continued deeper into the building, his footsteps echoing down a long, silent, sterile white hallway. He walked until he reached a plain black door with the number 39 painted on it in white. After taking a quick look around to make absolutely sure that nobody was watching him, he reached down, turned the brass handle, and pushed the door open. The moment he stepped inside, he was hit by a wall of chaotic energy. The office was brightly lit, and it was an absolute hive of activity. The air was thick with tobacco smoke, telephones were ringing off the hook constantly, a dozen typewriters were clattering away at once, and men in dark, serious suits were rushing back and forth with files and papers. This was the office of Great Britain's Director of Naval Intelligence, and with World War II having just broken out a few weeks earlier, everything was completely frantic. The spies that worked in this office were working around the clock, gathering vital intelligence, analyzing data, and most importantly, coming up with creative and sometimes downright crazy ways to trick the enemy. Now, Agent 17F was not actually a trained intelligence agent. He was the director's personal assistant, so he had absolutely no formal spy training. But what he did have was an incredibly creative mind and a natural talent for coming up with schemes that were so audacious, so out of the box, they just might work. And that particular skill was something the department desperately needed at that moment. The director was a very practical, analytical, and pragmatic man. And so he sort of liked having someone like his personal assistant, 17F, around, whose thought patterns were just so much more colorful and unconventional. He really did think differently than the director and all the other career intelligence men. So, Agent 17F walked very casually into this chaotic room. He strolled confidently across the floor, weaving through the chaos, and reached the director's private office door. He gave a firm knock. A moment later, the director's voice called for him to come in. 17F walked inside, went right over to the large wooden desk where the director was sitting, and he dropped the envelope he had been carrying right onto the desk. The director picked it up, opened the envelope, and started reading the typed memo that was inside. As the director's eyes scanned the page, Agent 17F couldn't help but notice what looked like a very annoyed expression forming on the director's face. Inside the envelope was a list of ideas that 17F had come up with for spreading misinformation to the Germans. Basically, they were a collection of schemes designed to confuse and misdirect the German military by feeding them carefully crafted fake information about what the British were planning to do. Now, this kind of deception is a very normal part of military strategy during a time of war. But the specific strategies that Agent 17F had come up with on this particular list were really out there. Even for his own wild standards, these were pretty bizarre. For example, on this list, there was an idea to have the British Royal Air Force drop thousands of soccer balls covered in reflective paint into the ocean near enemy coastlines. The idea was that enemy submarines, seeing these objects on their sonar, would mistake them for dangerous naval mines and waste time and resources avoiding them. There was another suggestion on the list to put fake intelligence messages into literal glass bottles and just set them loose at sea, hoping that German ships or agents would find them and believe the information inside. 17F also proposed that they print and mail out fake copies of the Times newspaper, complete with made-up news stories and misleading headlines, again, to try and trick their enemy. Agent 17F had been pretty excited to share this list with his boss. He was genuinely proud of these ideas. But now, looking at the director's frustrated face, it seemed like he was just getting more and more annoyed with each suggestion he read. 17F started to wonder if maybe he had pushed his creativity a little too far this time. But just then, the director stopped reading. He was clearly fixated on one particular idea on the list. He looked up from the paper directly at 17F and he said, "Actually, this one. This one seems workable." The idea that the director liked was actually based on something that had happened in a crime novel that Agent 17F had recently read. Agent 17F was suggesting that they get their hands on a corpse from the naval hospital, dress it in a British pilot's uniform, and then plant fake dispatches in its pockets. These dispatches would contain details of a completely made-up military operation. The plan would then be to put a faulty, unopened parachute on the corpse's back, fly a plane over the German-occupied coast, and drop the body out onto the beach. The idea was that when the Germans found the corpse, they would naturally assume that this was an actual British pilot who had died when his parachute failed to open. And if they believed that, well, they would very likely also believe that the information the British agents had planted in the corpse's pockets were genuine military secrets that they had just luckily intercepted. In the end, the director told Agent 17F that the list overall was actually pretty good. He told him he did a good job after all. And so, by the time Agent 17F left the director's office and walked back over to his own small desk in the corner of the chaotic room, he was feeling quite proud that at least one of his big, crazy ideas had potentially landed. 4 years later, at an absolutely pivotal moment in World War II, the British military put a version of 17F's plan into action. They called it Operation Mincemeat, and amazingly, it worked perfectly. British spies did indeed plant a corpse on a beach, complete with a faulty parachute and fake documents in its pockets. The documents stated that the Allied powers of America and Britain were planning to invade Greece and Sardinia. This prompted the Germans to move a huge number of their troops away from the Allies' real target, which was the island of Sicily. Sicily is part of Italy, and Italy was allied with Germany during the war. And so, thanks in large part to Operation Mincemeat, which was born from 17F's wild idea, the Germans were totally caught off guard by the invasion of Sicily, and the Allies managed to capture the entire island. This victory then paved the way for an invasion of mainland Italy, which was a major turning point in the war. And again, it was all thanks to this one idea inspired by a novel and proposed by Agent 17F. Now, to be clear, Agent 17F was not personally there for the invasion of Sicily, and he didn't publicly get any credit for his crucial role in planning it, even though Operation Mincemeat would eventually become quite famous. But anonymity was incredibly important for anyone working in intelligence, which 17F technically was. And when the war finally ended, 17F might have just stayed a ghost forever, his contribution, a secret known only to a few. But one slow afternoon near the end of the war, when the chaos in Room 39 had finally died down and there were only a couple dozen people still working out of that office, Agent 17F was sitting at his desk in the corner. He could overhear some of the other agents nearby talking to each other about what they were going to do with their lives after the war. And Agent 17F, even though he wasn't part of their conversation, internally asked himself that very same question. What am I going to do next? He was so good at coming up with these wild, fantastical ideas, and he genuinely had so much fun doing it. How could he just stop doing that and go get a normal, boring job? This felt like his calling. Doing what he did in room 39 was the only thing he really wanted to do. But then, as he was sitting there thinking, he had a realization. Maybe he didn't have to stop doing this at all. After the war, for years, Agent 17F kept on coming up with fantastical spy ideas. But this time, instead of giving these ideas to the British government, he wrote them all down with the intention of someday creating a book built around these ideas and a central character. And finally, in 1953, he published his very first book under his real name, Ian Fleming. His book was a wild success, and he went on to write many more books all about this same character who was a dashing, brilliant spy. And that spy's name was James Bond. One crisp fall afternoon, way back in 1830, a beaver trapper named Smith and his hunting partner, a man named Bowman, were hiking through the rugged Bitterroot Mountains. This is a section of the Rocky Mountains located in what is now southwestern Montana. Their destination was a specific remote pond deep in the woods that was rumored to be absolutely full of beavers. However, despite this promise of a big payday, almost nobody ever dared to go there. The area was also said to be cursed. The reason behind this sinister rumor was that about a year earlier, another hunter had traveled to that same pond all by himself, and he had never come back home. Eventually, a group of miners had passed through that remote area, and they stumbled upon his body. His body had been torn to shreds, and it looked like it had been partially eaten. And so, naturally, rumors began to spread throughout the region that this pond was home to some kind of vicious, man-eating monster. But Smith and Bowman, they didn't believe in curses or monsters. They were practical men. They believed in money, and they knew that they could make a lot of money from all the beavers they would catch at this supposedly cursed pond. And so, after several long hours of hiking through the dense forest, Smith and Bowman did finally arrive at the pond. They wasted no time and hurried to set up their camp. They gathered a good amount of firewood and built a simple lean-to, which is where they planned to stay for the next few nights. After that, they got to work setting up a few beaver traps around the perimeter of the pond. Then they followed a nearby stream several miles uphill, setting more beaver traps along the banks as they went. By the time they were done setting all of their traps, the sun was beginning to set. Smith and Bowman decided it was time to head back to their camp, the lean-to they had set up earlier, make some dinner, and then go to bed. So they started making their way back down the hill. They were getting closer and closer to their campsite. And you have to keep in mind, there was nobody else out here for miles and miles. They were completely alone in the middle of the vast, silent forest. As they were approaching their campsite, when they got close enough to actually see it, they just stopped in their tracks. Their lean-to, the one they had carefully built just a few hours ago, and all of their gear had been completely torn to shreds. It looked like a tornado had ripped through their small campsite. Everything was just thrown all over the place. And there were no people, no animals, nothing around. It was like something had come and gone while they were up the hill setting their traps. Now, Smith and Bowman's immediate reaction was not, "Oh my goodness, the monster from the stories is real." Their first thought was, great. A bear must have come through. Because bears were very common in this area. So, to them, this was just a major annoyance at this point. This was not confirmation that the pond was haunted or that a monster lived here. They were just frustrated that they had to set up their entire camp all over again. So, the two men walked over to their destroyed campsite and began the tedious process of rebuilding it. But, as they were putting their lean-to back together and repacking their gear into their bags, they both noticed something that was really quite odd. They were assuming that a bear had come through their camp. And why would a bear come through and tear all their stuff apart? Well, obviously, the bear would be looking for food. That's what bears do. But, as they were packing things up, both Smith and Bowman saw that none of their food had been touched. None of it had been taken. And a good amount of it had been left out in the open. So there was definitely an opportunity for a bear to get an easy meal, but it hadn't. As they thought about it, it was just so weird. It was clear that a big effort had been made to search through the campsite for something. It wasn't like an animal had just come over, batted a few things around, and then left. Whatever came through here seemed to have a purpose. Like, what was it looking for? What was going on here that felt so strange? But both men eventually figured that what likely happened was, as they were coming back down the hill from setting their traps, this bear must have heard them approaching and ran off before it had a chance to actually take any of their food. So ultimately, they just felt like they had gotten really lucky. And so, Bowman went to go start a campfire so they could make their dinner, and Smith finished putting their lean-to camp back together. But just a little while later, as Smith was reconstructing their shelter, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something truly odd about what had happened here. They had come up with this explanation that maybe they just got lucky and scared the bear off, but it just felt sort of weird, especially when you considered all the local lore about this place being dangerous to people. Forget whether it was a curse or a monster, there was just a general fear that something odd was going on in this specific part of the woods. And so Smith said to Bowman, "Hey, you know what? Just for my own sanity here, I'm going to take a look around and look for some tracks. Let's just confirm that this really was a bear." And Bowman was busy setting up the fire, so he said, "Sure, go for it." So Smith began walking away from the campsite, his eyes scanning the ground for any sign of animal tracks. However, after stepping just a few feet away from the light of the campfire, Smith realized it was just too dark out to actually see anything clearly on the forest floor. So he went back to the campsite, he grabbed a long stick to use as a torch, and he lit the end of it in the fire that Bowman had made. Now, with this new light source, he left the campsite again and began scanning the ground much more carefully, looking for the tracks of this supposed bear. At first, he didn't see anything. There were no clear tracks. There were just some broken leaves and some broken sticks, and some brush that had been trampled over, which suggested that a large animal had definitely come through here. But again, there were no distinct tracks. So he kept walking, farther and farther away from their campsite, until he came to a small clearing that wasn't very far from their camp. And in this clearing, he finally found some tracks. They were massive paw prints pressed into the soft earth, tracks from an animal with huge, fearsome claws. They were massive prints that certainly suggested this was a very large bear. And in a way, seeing this was sort of reassuring for Smith because ultimately he had come out here to confirm that it was just a bear, right? Not anything else. But as he was looking at these tracks, holding his torch low to the ground and following their path as they meandered through the clearing and back off into the woods, he noticed something incredibly strange about them. Yes, they were paw prints that certainly looked like they belonged to a bear. But the way they were spaced and positioned in the ground suggested that it was just 2 paws, not 4. A bear walks on all 4 legs. Whatever creature had left these prints behind was walking on 2 legs. Bears don't do that. And so Smith couldn't help but feel a deep sense of unease. He was seeing, clear as day, the prints of a bipedal creature with huge paws and huge claws walking around near their campsite. What could have done this? Was it a bear? He knew that bears could stand up on their hind legs, but they don't walk very far like that. This was deeply unsettling. And again, as much as he didn't believe in curses or monsters, it was hard not to think, is there some truth to all those stories? So Smith, now quite rattled, turned around and hustled back to the campsite. He told Bowman, "I found tracks, and I think they're bear tracks. But whatever it is, it's walking around on 2 legs. I'm telling you, it's walking on 2 legs. There are no tracks from a 4-legged creature out there." And Bowman just laughed. He actually thought that Smith was just playing a joke on him, trying to scare him now that it was dark. But Smith was dead serious. He said, "I'm not joking. The tracks are 100% from an animal walking around on 2 legs. And it appears to be an enormous bear." And Bowman, at this point, he said, well, bears can walk on their hind legs. But both of them knew, again, not for long distances like these tracks seemed to indicate. So the 2 men really didn't know what to make of this. By this point, their campsite was set back up. They had their fire going, and their things were sort of back to normal. and they weren't hearing any animals or anything odd in the immediate vicinity. So, pretty quickly, they both just decided, well, I guess that was just a bear standing up. Hopefully, it doesn't come back. And they just sat down by the fire and ate their dinner in a tense silence. After dinner, the two men eventually decided to just go to sleep. They were sort of in denial about the strangeness that was going on at their campsite. But they had both, without even saying anything, elected to just not talk about it anymore. They decided to just bury those feelings of fear and ignore this primal gut instinct that was telling them that something was very wrong here. And so the two men, they climbed into their lean-to tent together, they lay down next to each other, and eventually they drifted off to sleep. Several hours later, when Smith and Bowman were both fast asleep inside of their lean-to, a loud, almost moaning sound came from somewhere in the forest. It was loud enough that it woke both Smith and Bowman up instantly. They both sat bolt upright inside of their lean-to. It was pitch black, but they could basically see each other's silhouettes. They whispered to each other, "Hey, did you hear that?" What was that? Neither of them knew, but now they were on high alert. They were sitting there in their shelter, obviously thinking about the fact that this bear, or whatever it was, had clearly come through their camp the day before. They were hoping it wasn't coming back. They just sat there, listening as hard as they could to the noises coming from the forest. There were the regular night noises, the sounds of insects and birds and small animals, that kind of thing. But as they were straining to listen, they could hear something huge. It was making its way through the tree line, and it was coming in their direction. Bowman, just on reflex, grabbed his rifle. He held onto it tightly, wondering what he was going to do. Smith was also frozen, not sure what to do. And then, at some point, as whatever this thing was got closer and closer to their lean-to, they still couldn't see it. They were too scared to poke their heads out and look, but they knew it was getting closer. When it got close enough, they began to smell it. It was this thick, musty, earthy smell. And as the two men were getting ready to actually make a plan about what to do, because obviously this thing was back, whatever it was, they heard that noise again. The same noise that woke them up. But now, it was literally coming from right outside of their lean-to. And it was this deep, guttural, loud, almost human moaning sound. But it was definitely not a person. It was just this eerie, low, rumbling sound, and it was right outside the tent. And Bowman, as soon as he heard this, he just turned, aimed his rifle roughly in the direction of where the sound was coming from, and fired a shot into the darkness. As soon as he fired, both men heard the sound of this huge creature right outside their lean-to turn and start running away into the forest. It was just bounding through the trees. They could hear branches crashing. It was this totally chaotic sound as this huge thing retreated into the woods. And then, at some point, all the noise just stopped. And they didn't hear it again. The two men were so frightened by whatever this was. It certainly didn't feel like a bear. They had never smelled something like that before. They had certainly never heard a sound like that before. And just the way it was moving, it was so agile and so huge, and it sounded like something that was walking upright. Even just the steps it was taking right outside their lean-to, it just didn't sound like a typical animal moving around. This was different. And so the two men, they were terrified. They stayed up all night, wide awake, waiting for this thing to come back. By the time the sun finally rose the next morning, Smith was so anxious and so exhausted that he actually felt physically sick. He didn't want to leave the campsite just yet, because this trip was ultimately about making money, and they had not caught a single beaver yet. So this was not a profitable trip. If they left now, they definitely wouldn't be catching anything, and this whole dangerous trip would be a total net loss. However, both he and Bowman agreed that whatever kind of creature kept coming back to their campsite, it certainly did not act, walk, or sound like a bear. And whatever it was clearly very dangerous. So ultimately, what Bowman and Smith decided to do was to cut their trip short. But first, they were going to go check all those beaver traps they had set, both around the pond and up the hill next to that stream. Normally, they would do this together, and it would take a really long time to go to each and every trap, check it, and if there was a beaver in there, deal with it. So, what they decided to do instead, in order to be quick and get out of there as fast as possible, was they would split up. It was broad daylight now, so they figured they were probably safe from whatever this creature was. They would divide and conquer, check all the traps, and then meet back at the campsite before it got dark, pack up, and leave for good. A little while later, Bowman had finished checking all the traps that he was responsible for. He was coming back to camp with 3 beavers slung over his shoulder, and he was feeling pretty good. He had been pretty quick checking his traps. He was thinking, great, our plan is going to work. I bet Smith is done with his traps too. We can pack up and get out of here really soon. And so he's walking towards the campsite, and he can see it up ahead. And at first glance, everything looked to be in normal order. The lean-to was still set up, and he could see some of their gear was stacked up neatly on the ground. As Bowman got closer to the camp, he began calling out for his friend, for Smith. But Smith didn't call back. Now, Bowman didn't really know if Smith was actually back at the campsite yet. He could still be out checking his last few traps. So Bowman walked into the campsite, and Smith was not there. But that gear that he had seen from a distance stacked up in the middle of the campsite, well, it was Smith's gear. And he had packed it all up and stacked it there neatly. Which certainly suggested that Smith had finished checking his traps, had packed up all of his stuff, and had to be nearby. It looked like he was getting ready to leave, just like they planned. And so Bowman was thinking, okay, I just have to find him. Maybe he just walked off somewhere while he was waiting for me. So Bowman, he put his beavers down, and he continued calling out for Smith. He was just sort of wandering around the general vicinity of the campsite, hoping to find him. But Smith never called back. And Bowman started to get a little worried. Again, they were obviously on edge here. Some very weird things had been happening. That creature from the night before had totally freaked them out. And so Bowman started yelling louder and louder, and he started moving faster and faster, trying to find any sign of where Smith might have gone. And at some point, Bowman made his way into that same clearing where, the night before, Smith had found those strange tracks that showed a bipedal creature moving around. And when Bowman walked into that clearing, he just stopped cold. Because the first thing he saw was that there was blood all over this clearing. It was like a bloodbath. It was everywhere. And then, on the other side of the clearing, sort of draped up against the base of a tree, was what looked like a heap of meat. That heap of meat was Smith. Smith had been absolutely ripped to shreds. His body was just destroyed. His limbs were all twisted in different directions. He was literally ripped to pieces. Bowman didn't even have to go over and check to see if he was dead. He was definitely dead. There was no creature in the area now. It was totally, eerily silent. And Bowman was just staring at his friend, wondering what he should even do. But as he was standing there, staring at this just horrific scene, something else clicked in his mind. If it had been an animal that attacked his friend Smith, if an animal was responsible for this, it likely would have eaten Smith. Or, at the very least, there would have been signs that Smith was partially eaten by this animal. But Smith had no signs of predation on him at all. There were no signs that an animal was trying to eat him. His whole body was just ripped apart, like whatever had killed him just wanted to kill him and was basically flinging him around like a toy as it was killing him. And so, at this point, almost instinctively, Bowman knew 2 things for sure. 1, the creature from the night before had clearly killed Smith. There was no other explanation that made any sense. He didn't understand why or even how, but the creature had to have done this. And 2, the creature was not a bear. It could not have been a bear. There were just too many obvious signs that what they were dealing with here was not a bear, or really any other animal he had ever encountered in his life. And then there was a third thing. Bowman was thinking, I wasn't that far away. This horrifically violent attack must have happened silently, or just so fast that Smith didn't even have time to scream. It was like this creature killed almost surgically, despite the gratuitous and messy nature of the scene. And all of that said to Bowman was that he needed to leave right now. And so he did. He left his friend's body, he left all their supplies, he just turned and fled into the forest. Over the next several decades, Bowman just lied about what had happened to Smith. He told people that while they were out trapping, Smith was attacked and killed by a bear. And the reason he did that, the reason for Sim, he didn't tell people that it was some bipedal monster that wandered the woods and had slaughtered his friend, was because he felt like nobody would ever believe him. He thought he would look crazy. And of course, he would just be feeding into this local rumor that this particular area was cursed and that a monster lived out there. He just didn't think people would take him seriously. So he kept the real story to himself. That was until about 40 years later, when Bowman met a man that he felt like he could finally trust with his real story. This man was an avid hunter, and he was collecting unique stories for a book he was writing about wilderness exploration. And to Bowman, it felt like his story was a perfect fit. So Bowman told him the truth. He told him all about what they had experienced out there and the fact that he did not believe it was a bear. He felt like it was a monster, for lack of a better word. And this man who was hearing the story took Bowman very seriously. He took detailed notes as Bowman was recounting this horrific experience, and then he ultimately published Bowman's account in his book. In the book, the writer described this creature that Bowman and Smith had encountered in the woods as, quote, something either half human or half devil, some great goblin beast. Now, to a modern audience, when you hear the details of this story, the one I've just shared with you, the monster really sounds an awful lot like Bigfoot, or at least something very similar to Bigfoot. But the writer published this book and Bowman's account in 1893. That was more than 60 years before the term Bigfoot even existed. So, today, Bigfoot believers often cite this book, and in particular, Bowman's experience, as one of the very first documented accounts ever of a monster that is now a ubiquitous part of modern folklore. But the writer of this book did not go down in history as being remembered for documenting Bigfoot for the first time, or at least before anybody knew what Bigfoot was. No. Instead, this writer would go down in history for what he did 8 years after publishing that book. That was when he was elected as America's 26th president. The writer was Theodore Roosevelt. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. A man went into the Wyoming wilderness to do something he had done many times before. Go hunting. But within a matter of hours, something would happen out there that still cannot be fully explained today. A rifle would fire, but the bullet would behave in a way that defies physics. The man would black out. And when he came back, nothing would ever fully make sense again. What he later described would become one of the most disturbing and controversial unexplained cases ever recorded in the American wilderness. On the afternoon of the 25th of October 1974, a 41-year-old man named Carl Higdon pointed his work truck towards the vast expanse of the Medicine Bow National Forest in southern Wyoming. Carl worked on an oil rig, a tough job for a tough man, and he'd managed to get off a little early that day. His plan was simple and one he cherished, to go elk hunting. He wasn't just going anywhere, though. He'd heard whispers from other hunters about a specific spot, a place called McMarty Canyon, where the elk were said to be plentiful. As the truck ate up the miles on the paved road, Carl felt the tension from the work week just melt away. He looked out at the endless evergreen trees, the distant mountains capped with early season snow, and a deep sense of calm settled over him. This was his element. Carl was a true outdoorsman, the kind of person who felt more at home in the quiet of the wilderness than anywhere else. For him, solitude wasn't something to be avoided, it was something to be embraced. For a little while, he was just a man and the wilderness, driving along, enjoying the peace. Eventually, the smooth pavement ended. The road gave way to a long, rocky trail that snaked its way deeper into the forest. Now, this truck wasn't his. It belonged to his company, and the last thing he wanted was to damage it trying to navigate this rough terrain. So he made a practical decision. He pulled over to the side of the trail, shut off the engine, and got out. He gathered his rifle and his gear, locked up the truck, and started the rest of the journey on foot. The hike wasn't easy. The trail was not only covered in loose rocks that made every step a careful one, but it was also a steady uphill climb. It didn't take long for Carl to feel the strain. He started having trouble catching his breath. This wasn't just because of the exertion or the altitude. Years ago, Carl had survived a serious bout of tuberculosis. While he had recovered, the disease had left its mark, riddling his lungs with scar tissue. It was a constant reminder, a physical limitation that made strenuous activity a real challenge. But Carl was determined. He wasn't the type to give up easily. He just pushed on, taking it slow. Every few minutes, he'd stop, bend over with his hands on his knees, and just focus on pulling air into his protesting lungs. After about 30 minutes of this slow and steady climb, he noticed a change in the landscape. The dense trees began to thin out, and the sky opened up above him. He had finally arrived. He was standing at the edge of McMarty Canyon. The place had a unique feel to it. It was like standing in a giant natural bowl. The floor of the canyon was mostly flat, covered in shrubs, patches of grass, and a few scattered trees. All around the edges, tall hills rose up, creating that distinct bowl-like impression. Carl stopped for a moment, taking it all in, letting his breathing return to normal. He scanned the area, his hunter's eyes searching for any sign of movement. And then he saw them. Straight across the canyon, grazing peacefully in the distance, was a group of 5 elk. He couldn't believe his luck. To arrive at a spot for the first time and immediately find what you're looking for, it was almost too good to be true. A surge of adrenaline cut through his fatigue. He immediately dropped into a stealthy crouch, using the sparse cover to his advantage. He began to move slowly, deliberately, placing each foot carefully to avoid snapping a twig or scuffing a rock. His focus was entirely on the elk. When he finally felt he was within a reasonable shooting distance, he stopped. He slowly raised his rifle, the familiar weight of it a comfort in his hands. He settled the stock against his shoulder, brought his eye to the scope, and took aim at the largest elk in the group. He controlled his breathing, just like he'd done 1,000 times before. He let out half a breath and held it, his finger gently squeezing the trigger. And then he pulled it. But nothing happened. There was no deafening crack of the rifle, no powerful kick against his shoulder. There was just silence. It was as if the gun hadn't fired at all. He was confused for a second, thinking maybe the safety was on or the rifle had jammed. But then he saw something that completely defied all logic, something that his mind simply could not process. At the exact same moment, a dizzying wave of vertigo washed over him. The entire world seemed to tilt on its axis. He felt himself falling, a strange, weightless sensation, and then everything went black. The next thing Carl was aware of was a violent shaking. Someone was shaking him back and forth, trying to rouse him. His eyes fluttered open, blinking against a darkness he didn't recognize. A pounding headache throbbed behind his eyes, and a thick fog of confusion clouded his thoughts. He realized he was sitting upright, but he wasn't on the ground in the canyon. He was back in the driver's seat of his work truck. He looked out the windows, but the surroundings were all wrong. This wasn't where he had parked. The trees were different, the ground was different. The shaking started again, more insistent this time, and a voice cut through the darkness, saying his name. He looked up and could make out the silhouettes of 2 men standing outside his open door. He didn't know them. They were trying to ask him questions to find out what was going on, but when Carl tried to answer, his mouth felt strange and numb. The words that came out were a jumbled, garbled mess. He couldn't form a coherent sentence. The 2 men exchanged a look, clearly realizing they weren't going to get any answers from him in this state. They gave up trying to talk to him, and instead, they carefully lifted him out of the truck. He felt their arms supporting him as they carried him over to their own vehicle. Through the haze, he heard one of them mention a hospital. Soon, he was in the back of their car, of 2 engines started, and they were driving off into the night. And once again, Carl's world faded to black. About 30 minutes later, just around midnight on October 26th, Carl's wife, Marjorie, burst through the door of a hospital room at the Carbon County Memorial Hospital. The sterile smell and the quiet beeping of machines filled the air. And there, in the bed, was Carl. He was hooked up to an IV, with various monitors tracking his vitals. A nurse stood beside him, checking his chart. Marjorie saw that his eyes were open, but they had a distant, unfocused look to them. He was staring at the ceiling, but it was clear he wasn't really seeing it. As Marjorie stood there, frozen in the doorway, trying to process the scene, the nurse noticed her. The nurse gestured towards Marjorie and then turned to Carl. She asked him a simple question, "Do you know who this is?" Carl slowly turned his head and looked directly at his wife. But there was no recognition in his eyes, no flicker of familiarity. He just stared blankly at her for a long moment, then slowly shook his head and said, "No." Earlier that evening, Marjorie had been at home, growing more and more anxious. Carl was usually so reliable. When he said he'd be home by a certain time, he was home. But the hours had ticked by, and there was still no sign of him. Her worry eventually got the best of her, and she called the sheriff's department. She explained that her husband had gone hunting in McMarty Canyon and was long overdue. She asked if they could just send someone out to check on him. So, 2 deputies had driven out into the national forest. And they were the ones who found him, passed out and unresponsive in his truck. They were the 2 men who had shaken him awake and brought him to the hospital. But the story they told was bizarre. It wasn't just that they had found Carl unconscious. It was where they had found him. His truck was located a full 3 miles away from the main road, stuck deep in a muddy bog. And the strangest part of all was that there were no tire tracks. Not a single one leading to or from the vehicle. It was as if the multi-ton truck had just been dropped from the sky right into the middle of the mud. But at that moment, neither the deputies nor Marjorie were too concerned about the mystery of the truck. Their focus was entirely on Carl, who was lying in a hospital bed, a complete stranger to his own life. The doctor had spoken to Marjorie, explaining that Carl was severely disoriented and appeared to be suffering from profound amnesia. He couldn't remember his own name, let alone what had happened to him out in that canyon. The medical team had done everything they could. They ran a battery of tests, including x-rays and brain scans, searching for any sign of a head injury, a stroke, or anything that could explain his condition. But they found nothing. In fact, according to all the tests, he was in perfect physical health. There was no injury, no medical reason for his amnesia or his disorientation. The staff told Marjorie that since they couldn't find anything wrong with him, they didn't really know how to treat him. For the time being, all they could do was keep him under observation. Marjorie sank into a chair beside her husband's bed, her mind reeling. Nothing made sense. She was about to ask the nurse another question when Carl's body suddenly tensed up. He started looking around the room frantically, his eyes darting from one corner to the other as if he was searching for something desperately important. Then he started to speak, his voice agitated. "Where are my pills?" he asked, to no one in particular. "Where are they?" Marjorie had no idea what he was talking about. Carl didn't take any regular medication. The nurse was just as confused. Trying to soothe him, Marjorie reached out to take his hand. But the moment her skin touched his, Carl recoiled. He yanked his hand away and stared at her with a look of alarm, as if a complete stranger had just tried to touch him. It was a heartbreaking moment for Marjorie, seeing the man she loved look at her with such fear and confusion. 2 days passed. Carl slowly began to surface from the fog. He started to remember small things. He remembered his own name. And, to Marjorie's immense relief, he finally remembered who she was. Since all the medical tests continued to show that he was physically unharmed, the hospital decided to discharge him. The doctors theorized that perhaps being in a familiar environment back in his own home would help jog his memory and bring him back to normal. But when they got home, it quickly became obvious that Carl was not okay. He wasn't getting better. He was incredibly quiet, which was completely out of character for the usually talkative man. He would sit for hours, just staring into space. And when he did speak, it was often in that same frantic, nonsensical way he had in the hospital. He would suddenly get agitated, looking around the house, asking about his pills. He also started saying something new, something equally strange. He kept telling Marjorie that someone had stolen his elk. Marjorie would try to question him gently. "What pills, Carl?" "What do you mean someone took your elk?" But he couldn't explain. It was like he had these fragments of memory floating in his mind, but no context to put them in. He seemed just as confused by his own thoughts as she was. It was as if he was a prisoner in his own mind, haunted by memories that didn't make sense. Then, a few days after they returned from the hospital, something shifted. Carl came to Marjorie and told her he remembered something. A new specific memory from the hunting trip had surfaced. He described being in McMarty Canyon, seeing the elk, and raising his rifle. He told her again about pulling the trigger and how there was no sound and no kickback. But then he added the detail that he hadn't been able to articulate before. He said he saw the bullet leave the barrel of the rifle, but it was moving in extreme slow motion. He said it was like watching something move through thick syrup. He could see it tumbling end over end as it traveled slowly across the canyon. And then, he said, the bullet seemed to hit an invisible wall in midair. It just stopped dead. And then the truly impossible part happened. He watched as the bullet seemed to turn itself inside out, flattening into a strange metallic disc before it simply fell to the ground. He said that as he watched the flattened bullet fall, he felt himself fall with it, and that's when he blacked out. Marjorie listened to the story, and her first thought was that it had to be a hallucination. Maybe his mind, desperate to fill in the huge blank spot in his memory, had simply invented this bizarre and impossible scenario. It was the only explanation that made any sense. But a few days later, that changed. Marjorie was doing laundry, going through the clothes Carl had been wearing on the day of his hunting trip. As she checked the pockets of his jacket before putting it in the wash, her fingers closed around something small, hard, and metallic. She pulled it out and looked at it in her palm. It was a round, flat, metal disc. At first, she had no idea what it could be. But then, her husband's strange story echoed in her mind, the bullet that flipped inside out and flattened. She stared at the object in her hand, a cold chill running down her spine. It looked exactly like a bullet that had somehow been turned inside out and pressed completely flat. She couldn't believe it. This discovery changed everything for Marjorie. She was now convinced that something truly extraordinary had happened to her husband in that canyon. It wasn't a fall or a medical episode. It was something else. Determined to find answers, she and Carl ended up in the office of a man named Dr. Leo Sprinkle, a psychology professor at the University of Wisconsin. Dr. Sprinkle was not a typical psychologist. He was a firm believer in the power of hypnosis, specifically its ability to help people access repressed memories. He believed that traumatic events could be locked away in the mind, and hypnosis was the key to unlocking them. This was exactly what Carl and Marjorie believed had happened to Carl. The memory was in there somewhere. They just needed help finding it. In the professor's quiet office, Marjorie sat on a couch, watching intently as Dr. Sprinkle began the session. He instructed Carl to close his eyes, to let his head hang down towards his chest, and to focus only on the sound of his own breathing. In and out. In and out. After several minutes, Dr. Sprinkle told Carl to slowly lift his head. Carl did, but his eyes remained closed. He was in a deep state of hypnosis. Then Dr. Sprinkle asked the question. Carl, I want you to tell me what happened on October 25th when you went hunting in McMarty Canyon. With his eyes still shut, Carl began to speak. His voice was steady and clear, and he began to tell a story so incredible that it left both Marjorie and Dr. Sprinkle completely speechless. Under hypnosis, Carl recounted the events just as he had remembered them before, but this time he didn't stop when he blacked out. He said that after he watched the bullet flatten and fall, he too fell to the ground. But he was only unconscious for a moment. When he opened his eyes, he was still lying in the grass, but he was no longer alone. Standing over him was a tall, dark figure. It was wearing a tight-fitting one-piece suit, like a scuba diver's wetsuit. He said the figure was shaped like a human, but it wasn't human. Its skin was a pale yellowish color. It had very small eyes, no visible ears, and its mouth was just a thin slit with no lips. Protruding from its forehead were two antennae. One of its arms ended in a flat stump, but the other had a strange attachment at the end, something that looked almost like a power drill. Then the creature looked down at him, and in perfect, unaccented English, it asked, "How are you?" Carl said he was so shocked to hear it speak that he just automatically replied, "Pretty good." The being seemed to accept this answer. It told Carl that its name was also One, and that it came from a planet that was 163,000 light-years from Earth. It assured Carl that it had no intention of harming him. In fact, it said it wanted to help him. Then, using its arm with the drill-like attachment, Also One reached into a pocket on its suit and pulled out a small packet. Inside were 4 pills. It told Carl that these pills would heal him. It offered one to Carl, and for some reason he couldn't explain, Carl felt no fear. He simply took the pill and swallowed it. After he'd taken it, Also One asked him if he wanted to go for a ride. And Carl, still in a state of strange calm, just said, "Sure." Also, One helped Carl to his feet. As soon as he was standing, Carl saw a vehicle nearby that he hadn't noticed before. It was shaped like a perfect cube. In the next instant, without walking or moving, Carl said he was suddenly inside the vehicle. Also One was there with him, along with 2 other similar-looking beings. And, to his astonishment, so were the 5 elk he had been hunting. They were in a separate compartment behind a clear wall, like a transparent pen. Carl was sitting in a chair, as were the 3 beings. He then felt a powerful force press him back into his seat, the feeling of incredible acceleration. But less than a minute later, the vehicle came to a sudden stop. Also, Oyen turned to him and said, "We're home." The next thing he knew, he was standing outside the vehicle. The air was frigid and the sky was a deep, starless black. The landscape was utterly alien. It was rocky and desolate, with no trees, no grass, no sign of any life at all. In the distance, he saw a single, massive tower, a metallic structure that reminded him of the Seattle Space Needle. A light at the top of it was so intensely bright that it hurt his eyes to look at. Also, One led Carl, the other 2 beings, and the elk towards a door at the base of the tower. The door slid open silently, revealing not a room, but a space that looked like the inside of a large elevator. The entire group stepped inside, and they began to ascend. When the elevator stopped and the doors opened again, they were in a small, windowless room with metallic walls. On the floor were several raised platforms. Also, One directed the elk onto one of the platforms and then told Carl to stand on another one. Carl did as he was told. As soon as he was in place, a complex-looking device emerged from one of the walls. It began to move around him, starting at his head and working its way down to his feet, scanning him. He was vaguely aware that the elk were being scanned in the same way. When the process was finished, the device made a soft beeping sound and retracted back into the wall. Also One looked over at Carl and said, "The elk are what we needed, but you're not. We're going to take you back to Earth now." And just like that, Carl said the next thing he knew, he was back in his work truck. The world was dark, and he was being shaken awake by the 2 sheriff's deputies. Back in Dr. Sprinkle's office, Carl finished his story. "Doctor." Sprinkle snapped his fingers, and Carl's eyes opened. The hypnosis was over. He looked around, a bit dazed, as if waking from a long dream. The 3 of them sat in complete silence, the air thick with the weight of Carl's unbelievable tale. As wild as it sounded, there were several undeniable physical facts about Carl's case that, up until that point, had been completely unexplainable. And the story he told under hypnosis, as impossible as it seemed, accounted for every single one of them. First, there was the matter of the truck. It was found 3 miles from where he parked it, stuck in a bog with no tire tracks. Investigators had been stumped. There was no conventional way for that vehicle to have gotten there. But if it had been transported, as Carl's story suggested, that would explain its impossible location. Second, there was the bullet. When Marjorie had a ballistics expert examine the flattened metal disc, they were baffled. They said there was no known force on Earth, no type of impact or pressure that could cause a bullet to deform in that specific way, to be essentially turned inside out. It defied the laws of physics as we know them. And the third, and perhaps most compelling piece of evidence, was found in Carl's own body. When the doctors at the hospital took x-rays of his chest, they found something medically impossible. For decades, Carl's lungs had been covered in thick scar tissue from his battle with tuberculosis. Those scars were on all his previous medical records. But on the new x-rays, they were gone. Completely vanished. The doctors had no explanation. It was as if his lungs had been miraculously healed. The story of Also One giving him a pill that would heal him suddenly took on a chilling new significance. For decades, skeptics and researchers have picked apart Carl Higdon's story, trying to find a logical explanation for what happened that day. But no one ever has. No one has ever been able to offer a better explanation for the relocated truck, the physically impossible bullet, and the miraculous healing of his lungs. Because of this, the strange and unbelievable account of a Wyoming oil rigger remains one of the most credible and deeply unsettling alien abduction cases ever recorded. And to this day, there is still no clear explanation of what really happened to Carl Higdon in that forest. Some people believe it was a psychological breakdown. Others point to a series of coincidences that science is still struggling to fully explain. And a few people believe that it is something much more concerning than we are willing to accept. Because no matter how you look at it, 3 things remain true. A man ventures into the wilderness of Wyoming and returns with missing memories. A piece of metal that shouldn't exist. And a body has somehow been cured of a disease he had carried for decades. So the question is not just what happened to Carl Higdon. Are we really ready to know the answer? There is a vast, uncharted region of territory known as the Northwest Territories that may be found at the farthest northernmost part of Canada. This is an area of unadulterated, breathtaking beauty. The globe is filled with vast forests, rugged mountains, and rivers that are both powerful and winding. In order to provide you with an idea of the magnitude of this single land, it is 4 times larger than the entirety of the country of Germany. Nevertheless, the Northwest Territories have a population of approximately 50,000 people, in contrast to Germany, which is home to more than 80 million people. This location is among the most inaccessible, rugged, and sparsely populated areas on the entire planet. A land that is truly wild. In addition, a valley may be found smack dab in the middle of this enormous wilderness. A region of terrain that is 10,000 square miles in size and is so remote and difficult to access that it is thought that there are still parts of it that no human being has ever set foot in. The Nahanni Valley is the name given to this location. Over the course of several centuries, the Nahanni Valley has been a site of lore. A location that has been discussed in hushed tones between campfires among people. The indigenous peoples of the area have said for a long time that it is a place that should be avoided. Dark ghosts and odd happenings can be found in this location. The Naha were notable for being one of the first known tribes to attempt to establish a home there. The valley was their home for a period of time, but eventually, for reasons that are not clear, they disappeared. Suddenly, they vanished, leaving behind a vibrant community that had been there for a day with them. As if they had just vanished into the thin, chilly air, all of their possessions, including their pottery, their tools, and their dwellings, were left behind. It was only in their writings that they left any traces behind. In their writing, they described odd animals that were pallid and hunted the forests at night. White devils, or Swahila, was the name they gave to them. From the beginning of their writings, they were overwhelmed with an ever-increasing sense of fear regarding these aliens, and suddenly, they simply stopped writing. The Naha had passed away. The other tribes that inhabited in the area did not completely disappear, but they did run away. As they packed up their belongings and left the valley, they vowed that they would never return, therefore establishing the Nahanni as a location that was both cursed and forbidden. These were merely thought to be old tales, folklore that was intended to keep people away for a considerable amount of time. At the beginning of the 20th century, however, a sequence of actual events began to take place in the Nahanni Valley. The occurrences were so peculiar and terrible that they gave the impression that the old legends might not be legends at all. The true beginning of our story takes place in 1904, with three brothers. Willie, Frank, and Charlie McLeod were the four individuals in question. Gold prospectors who lived and worked in the Northwest Territories were the toughest and most experienced individuals in the industry. It was common knowledge that they were familiar with the tales that were told about the Nahanni Valley. They were well aware that it was regarded as a foreboding and even haunted location. In contrast, a gold prospector may view a location that everyone else is too terrified to explore as an opportunity to pursue their interests. Assuming that no one had entered the room, they reasoned that the gold must have been taken by no one. The Nahanni Valley is a place that is so beautiful and unspoiled that it is impossible for there not to be gold there. Consequently, the three McLeod brothers made the decision that they were going to be the ones to face the valley, despite the cautions and the horrible legends that were spoken about it. They said their goodbyes to their family, gathered their belongings, and then embarked on their journey through the wilderness. The process of entering the valley was a challenge in and of itself. At that time, there were no highways or actual trails. The decision to travel by boat meant that they would have to endure a difficult trek upriver. They had to cross perilous waters, and at numerous points, they were required to physically disassemble their boat, take the pieces of lumber and their gear up and past large waterfalls, and then reconstruct the boat on the opposite side of the river. Although it was a difficult and grueling process that would have deterred the majority of people, the McLeods were unwavering in their commitment. In due time, the effort that they put in paid off. Ironically, the Flat River is a violent and turbulent river that slices through the middle of the valley. They arrived to the primary waterway that provides access to the valley. In order to find a little section of beachfront where they could beach their boat and set up a camp, they maneuvered through its rapids until they discovered it. They found themselves encircled by enormous mountains and deep trees that were completely silent. Despite the fact that it was a frightening environment, they were there for a specific cause. As they entered the icy river, they retrieved their equipment, including their sluices, and continued their journey. They located it almost shortly after search. Golden. And it's not just a few bits of snow. It was difficult to believe. One might get the impression that the entire riverbed was glistening with it. Over the course of several days, from dawn to dusk, they labored tirelessly to extract an extraordinary quantity of gold from water. This was the score of a lifetime, beyond everything they could have ever imagined achieving. Finally, they had amassed such a large quantity of gold that they were unable to physically transport any more of it. Their boat was completely full, and they were aware that it was time to depart, sell their discoveries, and then make preparations for a subsequent journey. As they began their journey back down the Flat River, they arrived at their destination in a positive frame of mind. They had a lot of money. They were successful in their gamble. It was clear that the valley would not allow them to go without a fight. During the course of their journey across a particularly turbulent stretch of the river, their overloaded boat became entangled in the stream, causing it to capsize. Anything and everything was hurled into the water that was churning in an instant. Despite being drenched in water and shivering, the brothers were able to safely make their way to the shore. As they retrieved their rifles and the few supplies they were able to recover, they discovered that the gold had been completely depleted. It was gone for all time, having sunk to the bottom of the swiftly running river due to its depth. Even though they were in utter disarray, they managed to pull through. They were aware that there was further gold on the other side of that. So they went back to the spot where they had initially set up their tent. They made preparations to begin their journey anew in the morning and put up their tent. They arose early the following morning and once again made their way to the river, returning to the very same location where they had discovered a fortune just a few days before. On the other hand, there was nothing this time. In spite of spending the entire day excavating, sluicing, and hunting for flake, they were unable to locate even a single one. As if the gold had disappeared, the Naha tribe had also disappeared at the same time. They remained for a few more days, but they were aware that they needed to go because their supplies were running low and their boat was no longer available. They were able to live, and they were aware that the valley contained a hidden riches that was sufficient for the time being. They began the long and painful journey out of the valley on foot, packing up what little they had left and packing up their belongings. Willie and Frank, the two younger brothers, were more determined than they had ever been before when they finally made it back to civilization. They had already begun contemplating their subsequent journey. In spite of the fact that they had saw the gold with their own eyes, they were not going to allow a single obstacle to deter them. However, Charlie, the family's oldest brother, had a different opinion. The encounter had left him feeling unsettled. When they were out there by themselves in that huge desert, he couldn't stop thinking about how close they had come to passing away. He conveyed to his brothers that he would not be returning. Even though he was certain that they would most likely discover further gold, he wished them luck. However, his time in the Nahanni Valley had come to an end. Willie and Frank were dissatisfied, but they were sympathetic to the situation. They discovered a guy named Robert Weir, who was willing to join them in their endeavor. The new Weir family, consisting of Willie, Frank, and Robert Weir, embarked on their journey 1 year later, at the beginning of 1905, with the intention of returning to the Nahanni Valley. Everyone in their community was aware of their intended destination and the things they were looking forward to discovering. They did not have a predetermined date for their return. A journey of this nature could have lasted for several months or even a whole year back in those days. You simply went, and by the time you returned, you had already returned. After a few weeks, months passed. It was a shift of seasons. For the entirety of the year, Willie, Frank, and Robert did not communicate with one another in any way. People in the village began to feel anxious, but Charlie, the brother who had remained behind, calmed everyone, removing their concerns. He informed them that his brothers had a lot of experience. They had a sense of what they were doing. He described the valley as challenging but not insurmountable. He reassured everyone that they should not be concerned. On the other hand, another year went by. Now, the year was 1907. Over the course of 2 full years, his brothers had made their way into that valley. Even Charlie was unable to dispute the fact that something was awry at this point. The amount of time that had passed without any communication was simply too lengthy. He was aware that he needed to go and look for them. He assembled a search group consisting of 4 other men, and together they embarked on a journey into the Nahanni Valley. They followed the same perilous path that he had traveled with his brothers many years earlier. After leading his men up the flat river, Charlie headed in the direction of the same shoreline where they had slept earlier. Upon arrival at the location, they discovered that his siblings and their camp had vanished without a trace. They proceeded on their way, making further inroads into the valley. At that point, the river made a dramatic turn that was almost 90 degrees, and this location is known as the Big Bend. As a result of this turn, they entered a portion of the valley that is commonly referred to as Second Canyon. The atmosphere shifted in an instant. On either side of them, the walls of the canyon climbed higher, giving the impression of steep cliffs that rose thousands of feet into the sky. Because of the steepness of the walls and the proximity of the walls to the water, there was no space for a boat to land. Once you entered Second Canyon, you were obligated to travel 10 miles in this claustrophobic passageway that was completely dark. The wind howled down the canyon, producing a peculiar sound that was similar to whistling and nearly sounded like a moan. They were able to see the dark holes of hundreds of caverns from a prominent vantage point on the cliff walls, which appeared to be empty eyes watching them pass by. The location felt spooky and frightening to be in. Later on, the guys would assert that they had the unsettling and persistent sensation that they were being observed at all times. As they made their way through the canyon, which was 10 miles long, they searched the water and the cliffs for any indication that the guys had gone missing inside. They were eventually able to emerge from the stifling shadow of Second Canyon, and as they did so, the valley suddenly became more open. This location, once again, included a few isolated stretches of shoreline, and they got a glimpse of it on one of those quaint beaches farther up ahead. It is a tent. Their hearts leapt for joy. While they were calling out the names of Willie and Frank, they navigated their boat in the direction of the beach. They quickly made their way to the campsite when they beached the boat. They noticed a figure sleeping on the ground close to some trees as they came closer to the position. It was a man who was unconscious and lying on his back, with his arm extended in a manner that suggested he was attempting to grab the weapon that was leaning against a nearby tree. After that, they discovered another body, this one lying face down, and partially within the tent and partially outside of it. They were getting closer, as the horrific reality of the situation grew more and more apparent. The heads of both of the males were out of place. Charlie was able to determine the identities of the deceased by using personal belongings that were discovered at the camp. Willie and Frank were his brothers. They were his brothers. Robert Weir seemed to be nowhere to be found. A search group went around the camp looking for anything. The etching was discovered by them cut into the tree at the location where the weapon was leaning. It stated, "We have found a fine prospect." This gave the impression that they had discovered gold. Nevertheless, a comprehensive investigation of the camp and the riverbank in the vicinity led to the discovery of nothing. There was not a single ounce of gold ever discovered. The event was really unsettling to witness. One of the brothers was obviously reaching for his firearm at the time of his death. It seemed as though the other individual had been attempting to escape from the tent. Moreover, their heads were completely absent. After collecting as much information as they could, Charlie and his men left the valley, bearing the weighty news of what they had discovered before them. They informed the mounted police about all that had happened. The authorities began their own inquiry into the matter. However, despite the fact that they discovered another skeleton a little distance downstream, which was also missing its head, they refused to identify it as belonging to Robert Weir. The official conclusion that they came to was that Willie and Frank had simply passed out due to malnutrition and that animals had taken their heads off of them. Charlie was angry with rage. He was well aware that this was not logical. What was written on the tree, where the bodies were located, and what was missing from the heads. As a whole, it indicated that there was something violent and something sinister. The case, however, was resolved. On the other hand, the news quickly traveled throughout the Northwest Territories like wildfire to everyone. A horrifying new chapter had been added to the story of the valley that was said to be cursed. Additionally, beginning on that day, the region of the Nahanni Valley that encompassed Second Canyon all the way to the location where the McLeod brothers were discovered was renamed accordingly. Eventually, people began to refer to it as the Headless Valley. A small number of people had the courage to trek inside the Nahanni during the subsequent few years. In addition to being too recent, the narrative of the McLeod brothers was also too terrifying. In order to entice people to enter a location where men lost their heads, the promise of wealth was not sufficient attraction. But recollections are short-lived, and greed is a potent driver of behavior. 5 years after the brothers were discovered, in 1913, a prospector by the name of Martin Jorgensen made the decision that he was courageous enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to try his luck at finding the brothers. As a solitary individual, he was a hardy outdoorsman who was confident in his ability to deal with anything the valley had in store for him. At a distance of approximately 70 miles from the Headless Valley, he ventured into the Nahanni region by himself, and, rather than establishing a temporary camp, he constructed a modest and durable hut for himself. Because he was confident that he would make his fortune there, he intended to remain for an entire year. And it appeared that he was correct for a period of time. Due to the fact that he was able to communicate the news to his business associates, we are aware that he discovered gold. A straightforward and victorious message was sent. It seemed as though he had hit it rich. Once a year had passed, he instructed them to meet him at a location that had been prearranged outside of the valley. After a year had passed, his companions made their way to the scheduled meeting location. Even though they waited, Martin Jorgensen did not appear at any point. Due to the fact that this was absolutely out of character, his partners made the decision to descend into the valley in order to locate him. They were armed with the directions that he had sent. As they continued to follow his track, they were eventually able to locate the site of his cabin. However, the cabin was no longer there. What was left behind was nothing more than a heap of burnt wood and ash. It had been entirely consumed by fire and gone up in flames. In addition, the decapitated body of Martin Jorgensen was discovered lying on the ground close to the decaying remains of the cabin. To reiterate, there was no gold to be discovered anywhere in the area. It was decided to call in the mounted police once more. Yet another investigation was carried out by them. Again, they came up with an explanation that was completely in line with the natural world. They came to the conclusion that Jorgensen must have used his stove in a way that caused an accident, which was the cause of the fire. Predation by animals was the cause of the missing head, as was the case with the lost head. It was yet another case that had been resolved, yet another horrible event that occurred in the harsh woods. However, the trend was becoming increasingly difficult for many people to ignore. 8 years later, in 1921, John O'Brien and an anonymous partner, 2 other prospectors, made the decision to test their luck and see what would happen. Despite the fact that they were aware of the tales, they were of the belief that there was a return for every risk. The Headless Valley itself was not too far away from where they established their tent. And very immediately, they discovered gold, just like the others had done. They disseminated the news that they had achieved their goals and that they intended to remain for a considerable amount of time. It had been a couple of weeks since they had begun their journey, and they were getting low on food. Along the path that they used to enter the valley, they had placed a number of animal traps in various locations. For the purpose of examining the traps, John O'Brien informed his partner that he was going to make the journey. It was a lengthy trek that would take him 8 or 9 days to complete, and it was a circuit. For the sake of protecting their wealth and supplies, his partner remained in the camp with them. In spite of the passage of 9 days, John O'Brien did not come back. His companions started to feel concerned about him. It was by accident that he came upon another solitary prospector who was in the vicinity, and the 2 men decided to undertake the mission of searching for O'Brien together. They continued to call his name as they followed the line of traps. They walked for a considerable amount of time. At the moment when the sun was beginning to drop, they entered a tiny clearing. One of the fallen logs was located in the middle of the clearing. In addition, there was a man who was seated on the log with his back to them. "John, is that you?" they yelled out, but there was no response to their question. Completely still, the figure remained in that position. They moved closer with increased caution. They made their way around the log, and as they did so, they saw that it was, in fact, John O'Brien. He was sitting in an upright position, his demeanor uninterested, and he was simply staring into the ashes of a small bonfire that had been extinguished at his feet. He had a book of matches in his hand, and he was holding it tightly. In addition, he had been fully and utterly frozen to death. It was a peculiar fact that the temperature had not been very low. The police, who later inspected the site, said in their report that it appeared as though he had been slain so suddenly that he had no time to react, no time to even realize what was happening. They said that it was as if he had been flash frozen. In the midst of the forest, he remained still, like a statue completely frozen in place. At this point, the stories were stacking up. Burned cabins, headless bodies, and a guy frozen solid make up the scene. The authorities continued to explain that each of these instances was distinct and unrelated to one another, and that they were simply the brutal facts of living in the wild. However, the general public was not entirely convinced. There was a widespread consensus that the Nahanni Valley was a haunted and cursed location at this point. Then, in the year 1926, an event that was both one of the most peculiar and chilling of all time occurred. In the valley, a wealthy hunting party made their entrance. There were perhaps 12 of them, and they were being guided by an experienced guide. It was their belief that there was protection in numbers. They established their camp in close proximity to the river, not too far from the Headless Valley. Nothing of note happened on the first day. After going on a hunt, they went back to their camp and spent the evening around a large bonfire, enjoying each other's company while exchanging stories. They awoke the following morning to discover that one of their party members had vanished without a trace. Annie Lafferty, a young woman, became absent from the scene. She had not yet removed her possessions from her tent. There was no note, and there was no indication that there had been a struggle. In the middle of the night, she had simply disappeared without a trace. The group spent the entire day looking for her, searching the woods and shouting her name numerous times, but they were unable to locate any trace of her. Eventually, they were forced to leave the valley and declare her missing to the authorities. An extensive and official search procedure was initiated. Because her family was so powerful and wealthy, they spared no cost in their spending. But after a number of weeks of hunting, they came up empty-handed. The valley itself seemed to have engulfed Annie Lafferty, as if she had been consumed by it. A man named Charlie, who was known for his solitude and his love of the outdoors, was found in a pub in one of the smaller villages located in the Northwest Territories a few months later. Some men were discussing the mysterious disappearance of Annie Lafferty, and he overheard them talking about it. A look of horror appeared on his face as he listened to the specifics of the incident, including the date and the location. It dawned on him that he had been present. Something had been observed by him. His astonishing narrative was promptly relayed to the authorities, and he went to the police station. During the period when the hunting team was stationed in the Nahanni Valley, he explained that he had been camping by himself in the valley. Even in the evening, he was close enough to them that he could hear their voices. He was not too far away. It was the night that Annie vanished, and he claimed that he was unable to sleep. It was while he was sitting outside his tent that he became aware of a peculiar sound. The sound that could be heard was that of little rocks being dropped into the river, one after the other. The sound was not a natural one, like the sound of rock slides. It appeared to be intentional. He stood up and made his way towards the riverbank in a stealthy manner in order to gain a better glimpse. It was a full moon, and it was shining brightly, which illuminated the area. He turned his gaze downstream, in the direction of the position of the hunting party's camp. He then became aware of it. A woman was climbing up a high, rocky ridge that ran alongside the river while she was absolutely naked. She was on all fours. Unlike a coyote, she was traveling at an unnaturally fast speed, similar to that of an animal. Both her hands and her feet were responsible for the dislodging of small stones, which then fell down the bank and splashed into the river with each step that she took. His ears had been picking up on that particular sound. He stood there, still, observing her in silence. It seemed to him that she was completely insane, and that she would perish from exposure out there. Nevertheless, she came to a halt just as she reached the highest point of the ridge. It appeared as though she was looking right at him when she moved her head. In addition, Charlie reported to the authorities that her face had been contorted into a frightening and inhumane grimace. As he described it, her eyes appeared to be utterly possessed. Because he was so afraid, he stumbled backward and hurried back to his tent, where he might find refuge from the danger. Over the crest of the ridge, the woman disappeared without a trace. Charlie was shown an image of Annie Lafferty, the woman who had gone missing, despite the fact that the police were still doubtful. Without any sign of doubt, he acknowledged it. He had seen the woman rushing naked on all fours into the dark core of the Nahanni Valley. That was the woman he had seen. There was no further sighting of Annie. The number of victims proceeded to reach new heights. In 1931, a prospector by the name of Phil Powers constructed a cabin, discovered gold, and then vanished without a trace. His charred cabin was discovered by a search party that had been sent out. Although the body of Powers was found inside, the investigation discovered that the fire had begun on the roof, which indicates that he would have had a sufficient amount of time to flee the building. As a result, it was determined that it was highly probable that he had already passed away inside his cabin before the fire even began. The year 1936 saw the disappearance of two other prospectors, namely William Epper and Joseph Mulholland. In addition, their cottage was discovered to be completely destroyed by fire. However, this time there were no remains found at all. Simply put, they had disappeared. At the campsite where he was staying in 1945, the body of a guy named Ernest Sabard was discovered inside his sleeping bag. Additionally, he was a prospector who had vanished without a trace. The search crew discovered him without his head when they found him. The year 1946 saw the occurrence of the last important incident. An additional large search party was dispatched to the area in an effort to locate a missing prospector by the name of John Patterson. The individual who was in charge of this search party was a man who was resolute, unyielding, and unwavering in his commitment to unraveling the enigma. They established their fortifications in the Headless Valley, which was the same region in which the McLeod brothers had been discovered. They were sitting around their fire one evening when, all of a sudden, a man emerged from the shade of the forest. The native man wore traditional garb and was dressed in traditional garb. Immediately, he approached the person who was in charge of the search party. His name was not disclosed by him. This is a terrifying warning that he just issued. After that, he informed them that they had to depart the valley without delay. According to him, there were white creatures that were walking around in the woods all around them, and they were very close to their camp. Before the leader of the search group could ask any questions, the man turned around, walked back into the forest, and vanished without a trace. All of the members of the search team were terrified that night by the horrific sounds that emanated from the forest that were all around them. In addition to the sound of enormous trees smashing to the ground, they heard screams and wails that went through their bodies. It was reported by a few of the men that they had witnessed tall white figures moving between the trees that were located on the edge of the firelight. As soon as the sun rose the following morning, they decided to give up their hunt for John Patterson and get away from the valley completely. In a later statement, the leader of the party, the individual who had entered the valley with such a high level of self-assurance, stated that he had never been more terrified in his entire life and that he would never again set foot in that valley. We were never able to locate John Patterson. After that, it appeared as though the odd occurrences in the Nahanni Valley had stopped. However, this is primarily due to the fact that people stopped going in. There were now too many of them, they were too consistent, and they were too terrifying to remain ignored. Thereafter, in the year 1976, the Government of Canada took an unusual action. National park status was bestowed upon the Nahanni Valley by the government. On the surface, it appeared as though this was a move to preserve the natural beauty of the area. In contrast, if you examine the park's regulations in greater detail, you will notice something peculiar. The area does not have any tourist facilities, visitor centers, or trails that are clearly marked. And perhaps most importantly, there are significant portions of the park that have been designated as being completely off-limits to visitors. Nobody is permitted to enter these areas at any time. Neither visitors nor researchers, and not even employees of the park. In addition, the Headless Valley serves as the focal point of the largest of these restricted areas. There is still a legal prohibition against entering the very locations where all of these strange and horrifying events took place, and this prohibition continues to this day. There are a lot of people who think that the government did not establish the park in order to protect the valley from people. They are under the impression that it was designed to shield people from whatever is located in the valley. Annie Lafferty continued to be a mystery, and the mystery of what happened to all of those prospectors has not been solved. The Nahanni Valley is a place where no one is permitted to look, and it is there that the valley conceals its information. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you saw today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of True Crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up?